Tucker Carlson did not expect the voicemail to matter. It was short and routine, the kind of thing most people deleted without listening twice. But something in the tone caught his attention. The voice on the other end sounded firm but detached, like a man following instructions without believing in them. The message said, "We pulled the segment. You know why? Don't ask again." The message had not been meant for Tucker. It had been forwarded to him by mistake through a chain of misdirected contacts from an old producer at Fox. The segment in question had nothing to do with Tucker's work. It belonged to Jimmy Kimmel. Tucker had never considered Jimmy an enemy or a friend. Jimmy was part of a world Tucker no longer trusted. Late-night television had become a soft weapon in a louder war. Tucker had seen comedians turn political and networks turn silent. But Jimmy had stayed in his lane until the night he didn't. Tucker had watched the segment once before it disappeared. It lasted less than 3 minutes. There was no laughter and no musical lead-in. Jimmy looked directly into the camera without smiling. His voice was steady but uncertain. He spoke about a pharmaceutical executive involved in the accelerated approval of a drug linked to irreversible side effects. He used a name that Tucker recognized from a classified data leak he had seen only once while working on a separate investigation. The next day, that episode was missing from every platform. Not restricted. Not age-locked. Erased. Tucker searched the digital archives and found nothing. The network's official page had skipped the date entirely. Jimmy said nothing on the following night's broadcast. There was no reference, no apology, and no sign the moment had ever occurred. Tucker did not mention it publicly. Not at first. He needed to understand why it had happened. He needed to understand why Jimmy, a man protected by wealth, influence, and mainstream approval, had tried to say something that powerful people did not want said. He began by reaching out to a former programming executive named Leah, who had worked at ABC before stepping down quietly in the middle of a contract. She had overseen scheduling and content approvals during Jimmy's early years and had been known for her discretion. Tucker had not spoken to her in nearly a decade. When she answered, she did not ask why he was calling. She only said, "You saw it too." Tucker asked whether she knew why the segment had been removed. Leah explained that Jimmy had flown to Washington, D.C. 2 days before recording it. He had told his staff to clear the monologue and insisted that no writers touch the script. Leah believed he had met someone connected to a regulatory body, though she could not confirm the details. She said, "It wasn't just pulled. It was flagged. The order didn't come from programming. It came from legal, and not our legal team. Someone higher." Tucker asked whose decision it had been. Leah gave a name. Tucker recognized it immediately. The man had no official role in entertainment, but he had served on advisory boards that evaluated media risk, including the impact of unsanctioned disclosures on public trust. Tucker took notes carefully. He did not plan to speak about it on air. He wanted to speak to Jimmy first. He called with no expectations. Jimmy answered. When he heard Tucker's voice, Jimmy did not hang up. He did not react with sarcasm or frustration. He only said, "So you saw it." Tucker said yes. Jimmy asked what Tucker wanted. Tucker said, "I want to understand what you were trying to say and why it was more important than staying protected." Jimmy was quiet for several seconds. Then he answered without emotion. He said, "It was about my brother. He trusted a drug they said was safe. He lost both kidneys within 4 months. Then he started losing memory. He stopped recognizing people. The company settled after 2 phone calls. They said they had seen it before. They admitted it off the record. Then I got a report from someone inside. The language was clinical, but the meaning was clear. They had known the risks for years." Tucker listened. He waited for Jimmy to continue. Jimmy said, "I wasn't trying to start anything. I just couldn't keep pretending it wasn't real. I knew they would pull it. I said it anyway." Tucker asked whether Jimmy had kept the report. Jimmy said no. He had passed it to a contact in Washington. He would not say who. Jimmy said, "I was warned the next day. Not directly. Just a visit. Someone I didn't recognize in the hallway outside my office. No badge. No message. Just standing there. Then gone." After that, the episode was gone too. Tucker asked whether he was afraid. Jimmy said he was not afraid for himself. He was afraid of what people would choose to forget. Tucker asked, "Why didn't you say something after it was pulled?" Jimmy said, because no one would have believed me, and I didn't want to turn my brother's story into content. Tucker said nothing for a while. He sat in a quiet room without distractions. Then he asked one last question. He said, "Do you want me to stop looking into this?" Jimmy said, "No. I want someone to understand that I tried. That's enough for me." Tucker opened a new file on his computer. He titled it Buried in Plain Sight. He saved the voicemail. He documented everything Leah had told him. He marked the timeline. He recorded the call with Jimmy and encrypted the audio. He did not know what the full story would become, but he knew it no longer belonged to either of them. It belonged to anyone who ever believed silence meant safety, and to everyone who had learned, too late, that safety often comes at the cost of truth. Tucker Carlson did not release the story. Not yet. He had spent most of his career pulling secrets into the light before someone else could decide they were too dangerous to share. But this time felt different. This time the story did not belong to a movement or a message. It belonged to a man who had once built his life around being untouchable and who now lived with the quiet weight of having touched something he could not explain to anyone on stage. Jimmy Kimmel had not asked for help. He had not asked for sympathy. He had only asked that someone understand what he had tried to say before it was taken away. And that kind of request carried more truth than any headline Tucker had ever written. Tucker spent the next week reviewing the evidence. He listened to the full voicemail chain again. He traced the source of the message back to an internal line tied to a risk compliance officer at the parent company of ABC. The number was registered to a New York office, but the call had originated in D.C. That detail stayed with him, because it meant the decision to suppress the segment had come not just from a network, but from a shared interest between corporate and federal influence. Tucker sent the audio to a private analyst he trusted. The response came back within 2 hours. The voice in the message matched a former attorney who had worked on 2 high-profile settlements involving off-label drug injuries. The attorney had since moved into what was known informally as media damage control. His job was not to stop stories. His job was to remove them so completely that no one remembered they had ever existed. Tucker reviewed Jimmy's timeline again. Jimmy had flown to D.C. under a personal alias used only for family emergencies. The flight logs confirmed it. There had been no press, no appearance, no business meeting listed. Jimmy had taken the red-eye back to Los Angeles and gone straight to the studio. The segment had been taped without an audience. The staff on set that day had been instructed to leave after setup. The editor who processed the file had uploaded it under a false working title. By the time the segment reached the review board, a copy had already been flagged and removed. The segment was never officially aired, but it had existed long enough for Tucker to see it, and that meant it had passed through at least one unsecured network folder. Tucker contacted someone named Armin. He had not spoken to Armin in years. Armin had worked in digital asset recovery for a media security firm that handled storage backups for multiple television studios. Armin had been forced out after a leak involving classified footage during a national broadcast. He now lived outside the country and rarely took calls from anyone still involved in journalism. But when he saw Tucker's name, he responded within minutes. Tucker did not ask for a copy of the segment. He asked whether it had ever existed on a studio cloud. Armin confirmed it had, but it had been scrubbed using a deep redundancy overwrite. Not just deletion, but layered corruption. It was the kind of wipe reserved for content considered an existential risk to brand credibility or political neutrality. Tucker asked whether anything remained. Armin said there was one thing. A thumbnail file. Just a still image from the segment's beginning. It showed Jimmy sitting alone in his chair with no graphics and no title card. His eyes were not looking at the camera. They were looking down, like he had lost his place and forgotten what he was about to say. Tucker stared at the image for a long time. Then he saved it. He did not release it. Instead, he called a woman named Claire. She was a clinical researcher who had worked in regulatory oversight for early-stage drug trials. She had testified anonymously in a Senate hearing after being forced out of a safety board for flagging incomplete data. Tucker had interviewed her once, years ago. He remembered how she had spoken, not like someone angry, but like someone tired of knowing too much alone. He told her what Jimmy had said. He did not mention names or networks. He just said a man had come across a report that proved long-term side effects were known and buried. Claire asked whether the drug was still in circulation. Tucker said yes. She asked whether the executive named in the segment had testified before Congress. Tucker said no. But he had been photographed leaving a closed-door meeting involving members of a federal advisory panel the same week Jimmy returned from D.C. Claire said, then it's bigger than the report. They're not just managing the fallout. They're managing the narrative. If they buried it, it means they know it could survive discovery. Tucker asked whether she would help him understand the science. Claire said yes, but only if she could remain unnamed. She said, the danger isn't the drug. The danger is the silence around it. That's how damage spreads. Quietly, deliberately, through omission. Tucker wrote everything down. He began assembling the full picture. The timeline, the silencing, the report, the names, the thumbnail, the science, the trip to Washington, the meeting no one had documented, and the quiet return of a man who no longer wanted to be funny. He planned the release carefully. He would not call it an expose. He would not center himself. He would title the segment simply, What Wasn't Said. Before he recorded, he called Jimmy one more time. Jimmy answered. Tucker said, I'm not using your name. I'm not using your brother's story. I'm only saying what was done. Jimmy said, that's all I ever wanted. Tucker asked whether he was ready for the attention it might bring. Jimmy said, I've already lived with the silence. The noise can't be worse. Tucker hung up and began recording. He did not raise his voice. He did not accuse anyone by name. He explained the structure of silence. How risk is measured not by facts, but by perception. How networks decide which truths are too sharp to air. How one man, trusted for being harmless, tried to speak without irony and was erased before the public could hear him. He did not ask for outrage. He asked for attention. He said only this. A segment was removed before it aired. It contained no lies. It passed legal review. It was pulled not because it was false, but because it was true, and that truth served no one in power. You were not supposed to hear it, but you deserve to know it was said. When the video ended, Tucker did not check the comments. He closed the screen and walked outside. For the first time in months, the air felt quiet in a different way. Not empty, just honest. Tucker Carlson did not expect the video to be taken down. He expected resistance. He expected questions. He expected the usual cycle of controversy that followed every story that touched something people were told not to look at. But the response this time was different. There was no outrage. There were no rebuttals. There was only silence. The kind that did not grow from indifference, but from design. The video remained online. It was never removed. But the platform restricted its reach within hours. The view count froze below the numbers reflected by his private server. The share button stopped functioning on certain browsers. An automated notice was added beneath the title stating that the content may include unverified claims and should be viewed with caution. Tucker had seen this before. It was not a denial. It was containment. The video had not been deleted. It had been placed inside a digital room with no doors. The information still existed, but the system had decided who was allowed to find it. 3 scheduled interviews were canceled without explanation. One of his private email accounts was temporarily locked after a flagged login attempt from an unfamiliar location. A longtime source on Capitol Hill declined to return messages for the first time in 5 years. Tucker kept a detailed record of each incident. He saved the timestamps, the email headers, and the server response codes. None of it proved interference, but all of it suggested that someone was watching what he did next. Then, on the 4th day, he received an email from an anonymous account. There was no subject line. The message was short. It read, he wasn't supposed to have the report. He gave it to the wrong person. And now it's your problem. Tucker forwarded the message to Armin. Armin used private routing protocols to trace the message through 5 encrypted proxies. The original server linked to a legal advisory firm specializing in media risk mitigation. The firm had previously worked on 2 high-profile drug liability cases. It was not a threat. It was a warning. Tucker sat in his office and reviewed everything again. He played the voicemail from the network executive. He studied the still image of Jimmy from the unreleased segment. He read through the notes Leah had provided and the technical report Claire had helped interpret. Every piece still aligned. The story had not changed. Only the response to it had. What troubled Tucker most was not the attempt to suppress the story. What troubled him was how easy it had been. There were no denials from the network. There were no corrections issued. No one accused him of lying. No one defended the company. Instead, the story had been allowed to exist in a state of quiet disconnection, like a radio broadcast that never reached its intended frequency. That night, he received a call from a retired senator who had once served on a health and safety oversight committee. Tucker had interviewed him years earlier during a national hearing on pharmaceutical price manipulation. Back then, the senator had defended the regulatory process. But now his voice sounded different. He said, "I saw your video. I recognize the study you referenced. We received it 6 years ago during a sealed review session. We were told it had been retracted." Tucker asked who had made that determination. The senator said, "It wasn't a vote. It was a recommendation from legal counsel that we were advised not to challenge." The language used was that further review would risk public confusion. Tucker asked whether the document had been legitimate. The senator said, "It was real. The conclusions were never disproven. They were only dismissed. I can't speak to the motivations, but I know that the executive named in that study never appeared before our committee." Tucker asked why the senator was telling him this now. The senator said, "Because I'm retired, and because the same executive is being considered for a federal ethics panel. I believe people deserve to know what was buried." Tucker asked whether the senator would speak on record. The senator said no. He said his statement would not carry weight unless someone else confirmed it, and no one still in office would. Tucker hung up and documented the conversation. He added it to the growing archive labeled Report History, Restricted Access. That night, Tucker did not contact Jimmy. He did not want Jimmy to feel responsible for the attention that followed. Instead, he reopened the original script and began revising the next release. He would not make accusations. He would not demand outrage. He would present the facts again, in a new form, with greater clarity and fewer names. The next morning, a small package arrived. It had no return address. Inside was a flash drive and a folded sheet of paper. The handwriting was familiar. The message said, "This is the only copy I kept. Use it if it helps someone understand." Tucker connected the drive to an isolated system. There were 3 files. 1 unedited video, 1 audio clip, 1 scanned document. The video showed Jimmy seated at his desk in a quiet studio. There was no laughter and no music. He did not read from a script. He spoke directly, slowly, and with careful emphasis. He said, "My brother trusted a treatment that was recommended by every expert he knew. Within months, he experienced organ failure. The condition progressed. By the time the cause was confirmed, the manufacturer had already settled similar claims. They had seen this happen before. I received a report that confirmed they knew the risks. And now, every time I sit in front of this camera, I carry that silence with me. Not because I'm afraid to speak, but because the system around me has already decided what is safe to say." Tucker watched the entire clip. There were no edits, no cues, no performance. Just a man telling the truth as clearly as he could before the cameras were turned off. He closed the file and sat in stillness. He thought about the decision Jimmy had made. Not just to speak, but to send the video. To hand over something that had been erased and trust someone else to protect it. Tucker did not post the file. Not yet. He needed to understand what it meant to carry that silence. He needed to understand what came next, not for himself, but for the people who had chosen to speak before the system decided they no longer should. He opened a new document and began typing. He wrote, "The video exists. The segment was real. The man who delivered it understood the cost. And the people who silenced it understood the danger of what it might change." Tucker saved the file and disconnected the machine. He understood now that the truth did not always need volume. Sometimes, it only needed someone willing to carry it without letting go. Tucker Carlson stored the flash drive inside a case that had once held classified diplomatic transcripts. He placed it in a locked drawer, disconnected from any system with external access. He did not upload it. He did not copy it. He understood the weight of what it contained. The decision was no longer about whether to speak. It was about how to allow something to be seen without letting it be erased again. Tucker reached out to Claire and asked for a meeting in person. They met in a public park near the edge of the city where the trees were spaced far apart and the noise of traffic never fully disappeared. Claire arrived without a phone, without any documents, and without anything that could be traced back to her role in the original research review. She sat beside Tucker on a quiet bench and asked how much longer he planned to wait before releasing the video. Tucker told her that he was not waiting. He explained that he needed to be certain he understood what the full picture looked like. He said the story was no longer about who had spoken, but about what had been kept hidden long before any cameras had been turned off. Claire asked whether Tucker had seen the internal report himself. Tucker told her that he had. He described the video Jimmy had sent. He described the tone of Jimmy's voice and the careful way the report had been summarized without naming the company directly. He did not quote Jimmy's words. He only described the facts and the structure of the statement. Claire listened without interrupting. When Tucker finished, she said that the version Jimmy had referenced was not the first one created. She said the document Tucker had seen had already been rewritten by the time it was passed to legal counsel. Tucker asked what had been changed. Claire explained that the original study had linked the reported organ failures directly to the molecular behavior of the drug. The language had not been speculative. It had been direct. But after internal review, that section had been removed. A new version had been submitted, which stated that the correlation required further investigation. That second version was the one included in the settlement disclosures. Tucker asked whether the original document still existed. Claire said that it did. She said it had been printed and stored under risk management protocol in a private archive used by legal teams that specialize in liability containment. Tucker asked if anyone else had ever seen it. Claire said that only 2 people had viewed the unredacted copy. One of them was herself. The other had been a senior internal auditor who had died 5 years earlier. His death had been reported as a heart attack, but Claire said she believed he had taken his own life. She said he had spoken to her shortly before his death and had expressed fear that the truth would be buried without consequence. Tucker asked what exactly he had said. Claire told him the auditor had warned that the final version of the report would be shaped not by science, but by public tolerance. He had said that the truth was not being erased. It was being rewritten so that no one would recognize it. Tucker did not ask Claire for a copy. He knew that asking would have put her in a position she had already risked too much to avoid. Instead, he asked a different question. He said, "Do you believe people would care if they saw it?" Claire looked away for a moment before she answered. She said that people care more than they realize, but they have been trained to expect disappointment. She said that most people are not indifferent. They are overwhelmed. She said that when the truth finally reaches them, they recognize it, but they often do not know what to do with it. Tucker returned to his office that evening and wrote down every detail he could remember from their conversation. He opened a new document and labeled it Sequence, redacted before release. He added Claire's statement to the file and included her exact wording. He then began preparing the final segment. He chose not to name Jimmy directly. He chose not to show the full video. He chose instead to build the story from structure, testimony, and confirmation. Tucker recorded the segment using the same method he always had. He used no background music and no added inflection. He read the script slowly and clearly. He said, "A network segment was recorded by a public figure who had no prior history of addressing pharmaceutical accountability. The segment was not broadcast. It referenced an internal report that documented long-term side effects connected to a widely prescribed drug. The version of the report used in court documents had been edited. The original language, which established a direct correlation, was removed. That version was never released to the public." Tucker paused only to ensure clarity. He continued by describing the sequence of legal review, the role of media compliance teams, and the timeline of the segment's disappearance. He said, "The individual who recorded the segment did not accuse any person or company by name. He did not make demands. He did not speculate. He described a personal loss and attempted to explain what he had learned from it. He did not frame it as a political act. He framed it as a moment of moral recognition." Tucker concluded the segment by addressing the method of suppression. He said that the removal had not been achieved through open censorship. It had been achieved through quiet refusal. He said, the segment was never denied. It was never corrected. It was never mentioned again. It was erased before it had a chance to be heard. He uploaded the segment without promotional links or press support. The platform did not remove it, but the restrictions appeared immediately. Sharing was disabled in certain regions. The comments section was limited. The visibility algorithm marked the content as non-priority. Even so, people found it. The responses that followed were not loud. They were personal. Some came from healthcare workers. Some came from families. Many came from individuals who did not describe their stories in public terms. They described symptoms, unanswered questions, and the way certain moments in their lives had been followed by long silences from people who had once promised to help. Tucker saved every message. He created a new folder and titled it, Responses with No Platform. He understood that the story was no longer about exposure. It was about recognition. It was about people hearing something they had already felt and realizing that they had not imagined it. Jimmy had chosen to speak. He had been stopped, but his words had reached someone who listened. And now they had been heard by others who understood what it meant to carry the truth alone. Tucker Carlson began receiving letters that were not sent to be read on air. Most came without return addresses and were written in plain, unpolished language. Some had been typed and printed. Others were written by hand. A few included photocopies of medical summaries with identifying information removed. No one asked for a response, and no one demanded to be mentioned. The letters were quiet and focused. They described events that had happened to family members or to the writers themselves. They described unanswered questions, changes in health, and the confusion that followed when the explanations they were given no longer matched what they had experienced. One letter included clinical notes from a hospital visit in 2019. A patient had reported kidney failure after taking a prescription given during a treatment trial. The notes stated that the symptoms were described by staff as rare and unrelated. The same phrase appeared 3 times across the file, and no additional tests were ordered. The document ended with the words, "Case closed, no further review necessary." Tucker read every letter and stored them in a secured offline archive. He did not share them. He did not summarize them publicly. He treated them as records, not as content. He understood that the people writing were not looking for exposure. They were looking for evidence that someone else was willing to carry what they had been holding alone. He contacted Claire again and asked whether she would review a selection of the letters. He offered to remove all names and dates before sending them. Claire agreed to read a sample and provide insight on any scientific references mentioned. After reviewing several of the messages, she told Tucker that many of the cases included symptoms consistent with the early warning reports she had seen before the document was sealed. She said that some of the language in the letters matched phrases from internal summaries that had never been published. Tucker asked if that could be a coincidence. Claire said that in her opinion, it was unlikely. She believed that several of the people who wrote to him had either seen the redacted version of the report or had received information from professionals who had reviewed it without knowing its full classification. She also said it was possible that some of the language had been repeated informally by people working in clinical care who had tried to speak without naming the source of their knowledge. 3 days after releasing his last segment, Tucker received a call from Leah. Her tone was steady but more cautious than before. She told him that an internal review process had been triggered across the platform's contributor portal. She said that his name had appeared on a flagged list and that the reason provided was labeled as non-conforming content under policy review. She said that the label did not mean the content would be removed. It meant that it would be held in a category where discovery would be reduced and future uploads could be deprioritized. Tucker asked what that meant in practical terms. Leah said it meant that people could still find his videos, but they would need to look for them directly. She said his segments would no longer appear in recommendations or search trends unless someone already knew what to type. Tucker thanked her and saved a copy of the call log. He made a note in his archive and labeled it Visibility Adjustment, Non-Explicit Restriction. He understood what was happening. The information would remain online, but it would be placed behind a layer of silence that most people would never think to question. That evening, a package was delivered by hand. There was no return label and no note inside the envelope. It contained a small flash drive taped to the back of a book about medical ethics. One page inside the book had been marked with a folded tab of paper. It did not include a message, but the page it marked included a passage about the legal boundaries of disclosure and the threshold at which knowledge becomes liability. Tucker opened the flash drive using an offline device. It contained 2 audio files. The first file was labeled as a pre-roll recording from inside a studio. The second was labeled as an unaired monologue. He played the first file. The sound was quiet and filled with background noise from the studio. Jimmy's voice could be heard asking the crew to keep the camera fixed. He said that he wanted to speak directly and without interruption. He asked whether the audio would capture the full take even if the segment was later replaced. No one answered directly. A crew member gave a countdown, and the file ended. Tucker opened the second file. The sound was clearer, and Jimmy spoke alone into a handheld recorder. His voice was steady but quiet. He explained that after receiving the report, he had waited 3 days before reading it in full. He said that when he did, he went to sit beside his brother, who had been sleeping in a hospital bed. He said that nothing in the report surprised him. What surprised him was how easily it could have been ignored if no one had handed it to him. Jimmy said that he had never considered himself a voice for anything serious. He said that most of his career had been built around helping people escape difficult thoughts, not face them. He said that when he tried to speak on air, he had not wanted to provoke. He had only wanted to describe something true. Tucker transcribed the file carefully. He did not use the audio in any segment. He wrote out every sentence exactly as it had been spoken and saved the transcription as a private document. He included it in a folder marked Source Confirmation, Voluntary Submission. That night, Tucker wrote a new segment. He explained what it means to receive information not intended for public reaction, but for personal honesty. He said that when a person chooses to speak privately, it is not because they are afraid of being challenged. It is because they are trying to separate what is true from what has already been shaped for an audience. He recorded the segment without naming Jimmy or referencing the file directly. He spoke only about what it means to try and explain a loss without turning it into a lesson. He ended the segment with a single sentence that described what had taken place without suggesting anything dramatic. He said, "A story was recorded, not for effect, but because one man believed the truth should be remembered by someone who would not forget it." He uploaded the segment to his private server. He kept a local copy and saved the metadata separately in his archive. He did not promote the file. He made it available for those who had followed the story and wanted to understand the next step. When the video was complete, Tucker turned off his equipment and stepped outside. The air was still and the night was quiet. He did not feel victorious. He did not feel finished. He felt responsible. And for the first time since the story began, that feeling was enough to keep going. Tucker Carlson began hearing from people inside the industry who had never contacted him before. These were not reporters or producers. They were assistants, researchers, and technicians. Most of them had signed non-disclosure agreements at some point in their careers. A few were still working quietly under contracts that limited what they could say about the decisions made above them. None of them provided documents, but all of them confirmed patterns Tucker already understood. They described how review teams had changed their internal policies in the last 5 years. They said that in the past, segments were pulled if they contained legal risks or factual errors. Now, content was often removed based on predicted audience discomfort. Some of them used the same phrase without knowing the others had used it. They said the real goal was to preserve what executives referred to as emotional neutrality. Tucker took careful notes. He did not record their calls. He asked each one the same question at the end of the conversation. He asked whether they had seen the segment that had been removed before it aired. Most said no. A few had seen early versions. One of them said they had helped render the original file before it was renamed and replaced. That person described a specific moment that had never appeared in any of the transcriptions. Near the end of the segment, Jimmy had looked directly at the camera and said that the only reason he was speaking was because there was no longer anything left to protect. He had said that silence was easier when he still believed the system could make mistakes honestly. But once he saw the report, he understood that the mistake had not been an accident. It had been a choice. Tucker asked the caller if that part had been included in the internal backup files. The caller said no. That portion of the video had been clipped before final review. Tucker asked why that moment had been removed before the segment was even evaluated. The caller said they did not know. But they said that when a segment includes language that implies institutional awareness, it is often treated as unacceptable even if it is true. That phrase stayed with Tucker for the rest of the day. He opened a new file and titled it Institutional Awareness, Basis for Exclusion. He copied every relevant quote from the last 3 weeks into that file. He added footnotes and cross-references. He included timestamps from each contact who had confirmed the structure of suppression, not through threats, but through quiet redirection. He did not release this file. He kept it private. He understood that he was no longer building a single story. He was documenting how systems remove meaning without confrontation. That evening, Tucker received an email from a medical advisor who had once worked on a review panel for one of the companies named in the sealed report. The email included no attachments. The body of the message was short and written in clear, impersonal terms. The message said, "We evaluated the risk profile based on public tolerance, not internal evidence. That decision was made in consultation with legal and communications." The report was factually correct. It was reworded for outcome management. Tucker replied with a single sentence. He said, "Thank you for confirming." He saved the message in a folder labeled Independent Confirmation, Policy over Evidence. He spent the next 3 hours writing a news segment. He did not refer to Jimmy. He did not name the company. He described the process by which truth becomes unacceptable, not because it is false, but because it creates consequences for people who were never supposed to carry the burden of knowing. He recorded the segment using his standard setup. He read each sentence slowly and without inflection. He said, "A report was written to describe a pattern of harm." The report was reviewed. The facts were not challenged. The language was softened. The softened version was shared. The original version was removed. The public never saw either. But one man did. He paused for clarity, then continued. He said, "The man who saw the original version was not an investigator. He was not a whistleblower. He was a performer. But when he spoke, he stopped performing. He explained what the document meant, and he described what had happened to someone he loved. He was not angry. He was not reckless. He was exact. And because of that, he was silenced. He did not raise his voice. He did not build tension. He delivered the information without commentary. He closed the segment by saying, "The document still exists. The consequences still exist. The silence still exists. But so does the voice that broke it." He uploaded the file to his server. He submitted it to a small archive that stored digital evidence collected by private researchers. He labeled it with a date, a source key, and a summary of confirmed testimony. He did not send it to the press. He did not promote it through partnerships. He made it available to the people who had been following from the beginning. He believed that would be enough. That night, he received a short message from Jimmy. It contained no punctuation and no request. It said, "I saw the segment, thank you for getting it right." Tucker read the message twice. Then he closed the screen. He understood now that this was no longer about exposure. It was about endurance. It was about carrying the truth quietly and placing it where others could find it without needing permission. And that was enough for him to continue. The following morning, Tucker Carlson received a voice message from a man who identified himself only by first name. The man said he had worked in litigation support for a firm involved in early settlement discussions related to the same drug that appeared in the sealed report. He did not provide documents, but he offered a specific detail about the language used in the redacted version of the report. He explained that the wording had not been selected by a scientist or a regulatory reviewer. It had been recommended by a private consultant brought in to assess reputational exposure. This consultant had previously worked on brand rehabilitation for a separate recall in an unrelated industry. The phrase he introduced to the revised report was not drawn from medical literature. It said, "Observed correlation lacks persistent clinical predictability." Tucker compared that sentence to the language from the original version of the report. In the first draft, the phrasing had been direct and repeatable pattern observed across controlled environments. The meaning between the two versions was clear. The first had indicated cause. The second had suggested uncertainty. The facts remained consistent, but the conclusions had been softened to reduce consequence. Tucker contacted Claire and asked whether she had ever seen that second phrase used in a scientific review. Claire said she had not. She told him the wording was not designed to clarify. It was designed to create distance. She said that when a fact cannot be disproven, the next step is to make it unreadable. Tucker added this to a document he had been building quietly. He titled it Language Edits, Reduction Without Denial. In that file, he logged each sentence from the original report that had been changed, along with the purpose behind those changes as described by the sources who had seen both versions. Later that same day, he received an email from a woman who had worked in communications for a pharmaceutical firm. She confirmed that the phrase in question had been used in a draft campaign several years earlier. She said the draft had been rejected by the marketing team for being too cautious, but the wording had remained on file in internal copy templates. She said the phrase had been created not to explain anything, but to survive scrutiny if reviewed in court. Tucker added her message to the archive. He wrote a note beneath the submission. It said, "Language was altered not to mislead, but to neutralize." The new version did not contradict the findings. It removed the responsibility to act on them. That evening, Tucker began writing a new segment. He did not reference the original report by name. He did not use the name of the drug or the company. He focused only on the relationship between language and silence. He said, "When a fact is too large to hide, it is rewritten. It is placed inside a sentence that appears accurate, but which no longer moves the reader toward understanding. The truth is not deleted. It is placed behind a form of clarity that no longer leads to meaning." He continued by saying that once language has been used to weaken the emotional and legal force of a finding, the public can no longer respond. The urgency is gone, not because the risk has changed, but because the structure of the sentence no longer demands attention. Tucker recorded the segment using his standard format. He spoke in a steady tone, without added emphasis or commentary. He said, "This is not censorship. This is formatting. This is how a report remains visible while its meaning is removed from the minds of those who read it." He uploaded the file to his private server. He included a short description that explained the purpose of the segment. He did not describe it as an exposé. He described it as a record of how language had been used to replace consequence with distance. Later that night, he received a short message from Jimmy. It included one sentence. Jimmy wrote, "I didn't understand the language, but I understood what they were trying not to say." Tucker saved the message. He replied only once. He said, "You were never supposed to understand it. That's what makes it so dangerous. You listened anyway." He stored the conversation in a folder labeled Untrained Interpretation, Primary Recognition. He understood that Jimmy had not been trained in legal review or scientific communication, but he had seen what mattered. He had recognized when something had been removed from plain sight and replaced with a sentence that had no urgency. Tucker reviewed the original recording again. He returned to the portion where Jimmy had paused while describing the report. At one point, Jimmy had said, "I didn't go looking for this. It showed up. And once I saw it, I couldn't keep pretending someone else would say it if I didn't." Tucker copied that line and placed it at the top of a file labeled Motivation, Point of No Return. He recognized that the story was no longer about proving what had been removed. It was about documenting how carefully the removal had been disguised. He prepared a final note for the next segment. It would not reference any new voices. It would only describe what he had seen from the beginning. He wrote, "Silence is not only the absence of speech. It is the presence of language that closes the mind while appearing to open it." He did not release the note yet. He saved it with a timestamp and marked it as pending. He understood that the next step would not be about exposure. It would be about interpretation, and that required not just the truth, but the structure to carry it. Tucker Carlson knew that the next segment could not focus on revelation. The facts had already been established. The video had existed. The segment had been removed. The report had been edited. The silence had been deliberate. What remained now was something quieter. He needed to explain what it means to carry truth after it becomes clear that nothing will be done about it. He created a new file and named it Interpretation, Life After Disclosure. He began sorting through messages he had received from people who had followed the story closely. Most of the responses did not argue with the content. They described the emotional experience of learning something they could not unlearn. A few messages included details about similar experiences. Some of them described medical outcomes. Others described what it felt like to speak up in systems where silence was expected. Tucker organized the messages carefully. He removed identifying details and grouped them by theme. One group described personal loss. One group described institutional denial. A third group described the feeling of being alone with something that no one else seemed ready to confront. He contacted Claire to ask a specific question. He asked whether she believed the silence around the report had caused more damage than the drug itself. Claire paused before answering. Then she said that silence does not compete with injury. It compounds it. She said that when harm is followed by denial, the people affected are left with no place to bring what they know. Tucker included her answer in the document. He added her words beneath a quote from Jimmy's unaired recording. Jimmy had said, "I wasn't trying to change anything big. I just didn't want to keep living with something small that had become too heavy." Tucker began writing the next segment. He did not add new information. He focused only on the emotional shift that takes place when a person realizes that what they said will not be heard by those in power, but will still be remembered by others who have carried the same burden. He said, "Most people who speak out do not expect justice. They expect rejection. What surprises them is not the silence from institutions. It is the quiet recognition from strangers who have never met them but know exactly what they are describing." He continued by explaining that when someone speaks the truth in a system that does not acknowledge it, the system does not collapse. It continues as before. But something changes in the people who hear it. That change is not loud. It is steady. And over time, it becomes impossible to ignore. Tucker said, "This is not about exposure anymore. It is about what happens when truth is seen, but not responded to. That moment defines whether the story will disappear or live on through the people who felt it without needing to be convinced." He read the segment aloud in his usual voice. He made sure every sentence was complete. He avoided metaphors, slogans, and stylistic devices. He delivered only what the story had earned. He said, "The man who tried to speak did not fail." His voice reached the people who understood it. That was not the goal, but it became the result. And now, the truth exists in a form that cannot be deleted. It is no longer tied to a platform or a file. It is tied to memory. Tucker finished the recording and stored it offline. He created a version with citations for archival use. He did not plan to release the transcript widely. He intended it only for those who had followed the story closely enough to know why the words mattered. That night, he received a message from a person who said they had worked on distribution clearance for syndicated entertainment. The message confirmed that the segment had reached internal review but had been withdrawn before approval. The writer said they did not see the full video, but they saw the internal notice. It said the segment contained language that could create confusion about medical safety. The message ended with a sentence that said, "There was nothing false in what he said." The problem was that people might believe it too quickly. Tucker added the message to a folder labeled Suppression by Anticipated Interpretation. He made a note explaining that truth does not need to be disproven to be removed. It only needs to be reframed as disruptive to future plans. He returned to the transcription of Jimmy's private recording. One line stood out. Jimmy had said, "I think the people who pulled it weren't angry. I think they were afraid of what would happen if too many people understood it at once." Tucker included that line in the next file. He paired it with a response he had written but never sent. It said, "They do not fear lies. They fear recognition." He saved the document and closed the system for the night. He understood now that the story no longer belonged to the person who recorded it, or to the people who tried to remove it. It belonged to the people who had seen something true and chose not to look away. And they would remember what they had heard. Tucker Carlson no longer expected the story to provoke a public reaction. He had already seen how stories like this one were not erased in obvious ways. They were not denied. They were not challenged directly. Instead, they were placed just far enough outside the margins of relevance that they would not be remembered clearly. The original segment had never aired. The report had been rewritten. The clearest statements had been removed before the video was seen by the public. The questions it raised were still valid. The evidence still existed. But the silence that followed had created a gap between what was known and what people were allowed to carry forward without explanation. Tucker spent several days assembling a final version of the story. He did not plan to release it as a segment. He created a file that contained only verified information. He removed opinion and speculation. He included a timeline of events, with references to source material and the names of individuals who had provided confirmation. He labeled the file Structured Record, Suppressed Disclosure. He included a written introduction that explained the reason the file had been created. He wrote that stories do not disappear only when people are silenced. Sometimes they disappear because no one is allowed to acknowledge that they were true. He explained that the goal of the record was not to provoke an investigation or a public outcry. The goal was to protect what had been said before it could be erased completely. Tucker saved the file in multiple formats. He uploaded it to a secured archive used by independent researchers and kept an offline copy stored separately. He did not promote the file or share it widely. He made it available to those who had followed the story closely enough to recognize the details without needing further explanation. Later that week, he received a small package in the mail. There was no return address. Inside was a notebook. The handwriting inside did not include a name, but the message on one of the marked pages matched the tone and language of previous messages from Jimmy. The message said that the segment had been recorded for one reason. It said the man who recorded it had already accepted that it might never be seen. He recorded it because he believed that saying something once, clearly and without permission, was better than remaining silent with certainty. Tucker added the notebook to the archive. He placed it alongside the transcript and marked it as a supporting document. He did not list it as a confirmed source, but he included it as part of the record. He understood that not every piece of truth is delivered with proof. Some are delivered with language that could only come from someone who lived the moment being described. He updated the archive and included a final entry. He described what had happened to the segment, how the report had been altered, and how the man who tried to speak had been stopped without confrontation. He explained that the segment was not removed because it was false. It was removed because it was honest in a way that the system could not absorb without consequence. Tucker wrote that the segment had existed. The report had existed. The man who spoke had meant every word. And although the original content had been removed, the message had been heard by people who understood what it meant to carry something that was no longer allowed to be seen. He wrote that the story now belonged to them. He explained that stories do not survive because they are defended in public. They survive because someone chooses not to forget. He saved the file, closed the system, and left the archive exactly as it was. He understood that the final responsibility was not to reveal something new. The responsibility was to make sure that what had already been revealed would still exist in a form that could not be quietly taken away. And that responsibility had been fulfilled. Tucker Carlson did not issue a final statement about the story. He did not present a summary or offer a concluding opinion. He understood that the story had reached a point where additional commentary would not change what had already happened. The segment had not aired. The original version of the report had been edited. The opportunity to speak openly had been lost before most people even knew it existed. What remained was not a question of whether the truth had been spoken. It had been. What remained was the fact that the systems around it had chosen not to carry that truth forward. Tucker focused on preserving what could still be preserved. He finalized the archive with every confirmed document, message, and transcription. He reviewed each file to make sure it contained no assumptions and no editorial phrasing. The archive had been built to withstand scrutiny, not to attract attention. He created a brief note to accompany the material. It explained the purpose of the record. The note stated that when a person speaks without permission and is removed before being heard, the story does not end at the point of removal. It continues in the people who recognized what was said and remembered it without needing permission. Tucker reviewed the messages he had received from individuals who had followed the story from the beginning. Some of them came from people in related industries. Others came from people with no professional connection at all. Many described the same feeling. They described what it meant to recognize a truth they had never seen expressed publicly. He added one last file to the archive. It included selected quotes from those messages, with all identifying information removed. Each message described a moment of quiet recognition. These were not statements of outrage or demand. They were simple acknowledgments from people who had noticed something that matched what they had already felt, even if they had never put it into words before. Tucker labeled the file "Continued Memory" without visibility. He included a short description at the top of the document. It said the people who responded did so not because they were told to care, but because they already did. The archive was closed with no further edits. Tucker did not speak about the story again. He returned to his other work. He continued reviewing cases that followed similar patterns, but he treated this story differently. He kept the records separate, and he did not use them as examples in unrelated segments. He understood that this story had reached its ending not through resolution, but through completion. The man who had spoken had done so clearly and without performance. He had not raised his voice. He had not made demands. He had described what he knew and why he could no longer stay silent. He had expected the segment to be ignored or removed. He had not recorded it to be heard by millions. He had recorded it because he could not continue living with the silence. That recording no longer existed in its original form. But the words had been transcribed, the timeline had been confirmed, and the intent had been preserved. Tucker understood that no system had restored the segment, and no platform had reversed the removal. The event had not been acknowledged by those responsible for silencing it, but it had been remembered by those who had seen it before it was taken away. That memory no longer depended on public validation. It existed because someone chose to speak and someone else chose to listen. That decision had been made, and it remained.